This is actually the fourth time that I've been here in the last, somebody back there in the back's held up four fingers, last 5 years or so, 4 or 5 years, something like that. And it's getting to a point, and I said I feel at home here, that if I come back again, I might have to change my name from Gary Walker to Gary Walkerian among this august Armenian group. Okay, tonight we're going to talk about two heroes of the 1920s, Babe Ruth and Charles A. Lindbergh. These are larger-than-life figures. Babe Ruth especially, he was a really big guy. Lindbergh was actually on the slender side. I think of these two individuals in terms of the 4 F's. They were fascinating, flawed, and forever famous in the annals of American history. Now, it's necessary whenever we have a discussion that's relates about history, cultural history, political history, in this case sports history and aviation history, there have to be certain dates and that kind of thing that you read about if you Googled or in a history book. But what we're really after this evening is, what were these men really like? What were they like as individuals? And that's why I say they were fascinating, but they were certainly flawed. Let's start with Babe Ruth. I don't know, for years I thought this was apocryphal, of doubtful authenticity, but I've seen it in enough places that I'm thinking it must be true, that the Japanese actually stormed a beach in World War II with the battle cry, "Down with Babe Ruth." Now, how would they have known of Babe Ruth? Because, you know, the Japanese loved baseball. In the 1920s, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and other big Yankee stars, and probably stars from other American teams as well, they barnstormed in Tokyo and around there. They knew very well who Babe Ruth was. So even in war, down with Babe Ruth. There was another incident I'd like to tell you about. And sometime during the middle 1920s, Babe Ruth and the Yankees were on a train, and they were going through Illinois. And they had to stop in a town of 5,000 people about 10 o'clock at night to pick up water, of all things. That's how the story goes, to pick up water. Town of 5,000 people, 4,000 people showed up at the train station. They wanted to see Babe Ruth, and he had to get out of the train for a few minutes. And so that's what we're talking about, excuse me, when we're talking about being famous at that time. Now, Babe Ruth's name was really George Herman Ruth Jr. He was born February 6, 1995 in Baltimore, Maryland, above a saloon that his father owned in an area of town called Pigtown. Now, I'm going to reserve most questions you have for the end, but I'm going to throw out a question right now. Does anybody know where the present site of Pigtown, where Babe Ruth was born, does anybody know what that site is today? Apparently not. It's roughly shallow center field in Camden Yards, where the Baltimore Orioles play. Oh, wow. Yes, that's a fact. Babe Ruth was born in one of the nicest ballparks we have in America now, Camden Yards, the home of the Baltimore Orioles. Now, Babe Ruth had a unique youth, to say the least. His father ran a saloon. His mother had a total of 7 children, of whom 2, Babe and a sister, lived to adulthood. His mother died when he was very young, and Babe Ruth, at 7 years of age, seldom attended school. He drank beer, and he ran the streets as a 7-year-old boy. Somehow, he caught the eye of somebody that thought that he ought to go to St. Mary's, which was a school, part orphanage, part reform school, part private academy, 850 boys, run by the Xaverian Brothers, a Roman Catholic order. Ruth entered St. Mary's at age 7 in 1902 and was there for the next 12 years of his life until age 14. Fortunately for Babe, but nobody knew that at the time he entered. He was just a wayward kid that needed some direction and needed to get off the streets. Fortunately, they played a lot of baseball at St. Mary's. And remember, this is the first decade of the 20th century. The American and the National Leagues, for example, were formed by then. The American League is still sometimes referred to as the Junior League. The National League going back to the 1870s or early 1980s, I believe. But at that time, the first World Series was in 1903, actually the year after Babe Ruth entered St. Mary's. So St. Mary's had lots of baseball teams for kids of all ages, and they took the sport very seriously. And what they discovered after a while was that when Babe Ruth was 7, for example, when he entered, that he was playing in the league with 8 to 10-year-olds. When he was 8, 9 years old, he was playing with 10 to 12-year-olds, not just because of his size. It's not that he towered over everybody, although he was a big kid, but because of his power. Now get a load of this. Babe Ruth was so strong as a kid at St. Mary's that when he would come up to bat, the players would all go back in the outfield. The outfielders would go back as far as they could to still be on the field, okay? Typically, the Babe, as we later lovingly called him, would hit the ball way over their heads and into other ball diamonds where they would have to go to retrieve the ball. That's how strong he was. They tried him at different positions, and then finally somebody, probably Father Matthias, and Father Matthias was a mentor to Babe. If anybody has seen the movie, the William Bendix movie that came out in 1948 called The Babe Ruth Story, Father Matthias is a key role in molding Babe into a mature individual and encouraging his baseball. Anyway, so they decided that 850 boys, we need an all-star game. So all the coaches sat down one time and they said, who's the best at first base? Who's the best at second base? They went through every position. We all know there are 9 positions in a baseball club. Babe Ruth, it was decided, was the best at every position at St. Mary's. If they had put him at catcher, there was no better catcher at St. Mary's, or pitcher, or second baseman, or anything else. Pretty remarkable. In 1914, Babe Ruth left St. Mary's, certainly the best thing that had ever happened to him in his life up to that point. And he was signed by the Baltimore Orioles. Now we know the Orioles, I've already mentioned them, and their beautiful Camden Yards. But back in 1914, the Baltimore Orioles were a struggling, lowly minor league team. And Babe Ruth was signed by them and played in the outfield for a month or two, and then caught the attention of a scout for the Boston Red Sox, and he was signed. And by the time Babe Ruth was 19 years old in 1914, he was playing for the Boston Red Sox. And what they wanted him to do was they wanted him to play pitcher. And the first game he pitched in was July 18, 1914. It's the first major league game he ever saw. He pitched in. He won the game 4-3. They decided pretty early on that this kid could hit. And when he wasn't pitching, they put him in the outfield. So he played for the Red Sox. Baseball fans pretty much know he once played for the Red Sox, but most of America, I think, he was a Yankee. Well, during his years with the Red Sox, he won 89 games, lost 46. At one time or other during those 5 years was the American League leader in strikeouts, complete games, shutouts, fewest walks, just about anything you could measure. He was on a par with some of the greatest pitchers of that time, like Grover Cleveland Alexander would be an example, who was over in the National League. Christy Mathewson, the New York Giants, also in the National League. But Babe Ruth was of that caliber. He was going places as a pitcher. But he never quite made it that far because somebody from the Yankees wanted Babe Ruth to wear pinstripes. And that person on the Yankees was Colonel Rupert. Colonel Rupert was a brewer and a very wealthy man, sort of a strange individual, lived alone in a huge mansion, always lived alone all his life. He was very envious of the New York Giants, which during the first 30 years of the 20th century, along with the Philadelphia A's of Connie Mack, they were the real team. And in New York, the team back then was the Giants. Well, Rupert thought the Yankees should be the team. And as a starter, he wanted to buy Babe Ruth, and he wasn't interested in his pitching. He wanted him to hit home runs. He wanted him to play in the outfield. Well, it so happened that in those days, the Red Sox were owned by a theater impresario by the name of Harry Frazee, who is on the left of your photograph up there. Colonel Rupert was on the right. And he was much Frazee, I'm sorry, I mispronounced it, Frazee. And I think of him as Harry Crazy. He sold Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees for $100,000, which was a lot of money then. But he also got a $350,000 loan from Colonel Rupert so that he could produce a show called No No Nanette. Okay, some of us have seen that show. So Babe Ruth became a Yankee, and he hit 54 home runs in 1920, more home runs than any other individual team hit. Now, there's a picture, a very famous picture, typical picture of Babe at bat. The Sultan of SWAT, they called him, the Babe, the Big Bambino. In his first year as a Yankee, he batted .376, led the league in 10 batting categories. And the next year, he hit .378 with 59 home runs. America had a new hero. He was wearing pinstripes, and his name was Babe Ruth. How good was he? Well, some people think he might have become the greatest pitcher ever. We'll never know. But he held a pitching record, 29 consecutive scoreless innings, not giving up a run. 29 innings in the World Series when he was pitching for the Red Sox in the middle teens of the second decade of the 20th century. That record stood until 1961, in the lifetime of most of us, I think, sitting here tonight. And when it was broken by somebody named Whitey Ford, a left-hander who also played left-hander like Babe Ruth, who also played for the Yankees. By the way, another record was broken in 1961. Just for fun, anybody would know?
Roger Maris.
Yes, that was Roger Maris. Somebody said that was the year that Babe Ruth's 60 home runs, which he hit in 1927, was broken by Roger Maris. It's only fair that we say that Maris did that in a 162-game schedule. Babe Ruth had played in 154 games. And anyway, so he was a great pitcher, he was a great hitter, and I always remembered this. Back around 1950, an old friend of mine, he was an older man that befriended me when I was a kid, he gave me a book by Connie Mack, who was the manager and owner of the old Philadelphia A's for 50 years. And it was called My First 50 Years in Baseball. And I remember reading in this book that Connie Mack said that people talk about Babe Ruth's hitting and even earlier on than that, his pitching. He says, but I want to tell you something. He says, I never saw anybody who was a runner on first base that could get a faster start to second than Babe Ruth. Now we're talking about a big guy here. In fact, it's sometimes, let's be honest, kind of on the fat side even. He was just a remarkable athlete. Like my son has said, doesn't sound too kind, maybe a freak of nature. I'm not quite ready to say that. Okay, you're looking at Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig on the screen right now. Two more opposites wouldn't have been possible anywhere. Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth played for the Yankees from 1920 until about 1934-35. Lou Gehrig, he's the best example of don't get sick, you might lose your job forever. Guy in 1925, I believe it was in May, of that year named Wally Pipp was the PIPP, was the first baseman for the Yankees, and he got sick, and they put Gehrig, who had gone to Columbia University and studied engineering, quite a contrast for Babe Ruth's youth. Put him in at first base. He continued to play the next 2,130 games without missing a single game until 1939, and when he had to withdraw himself from the lineup because he couldn't tie his shoes sitting on the bench in the dugout without falling over because of the incipient, what Lou Gehrig's disease, we'll call it. Man that had his own disease named after him. Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig were opposites. They were the powerhouse of the Birders Row, the Yankees in the 1920s. In 1927, when Ruth hit 60 home runs, Lou Gehrig hit 47. Babe Ruth hit 60, 107 home runs between the two of them. They weren't always friends. It turns out that Ruth slept with Gehrig's wife a couple of times, and Gehrig found out about it, and the two didn't speak for many years. Now, Babe Ruth is really something of a character. Can you read for? Yeah, sure you can. Vote for Al Smith. And people in this audience know who Al Smith was? Some of you probably do. He was the 4-time Democratic governor of New York State, but keep in mind back then they were 2-year terms. So he served a total of 8 years, and he was the first Roman Catholic to be nominated for president, which he was in 1928. And Babe Ruth, also Catholic. I'm not sure how good a one. Al Smith was a good Catholic. But anyway, he's wearing an Al Smith sign with his cigar hanging out there. But I call this the wit and wisdom of Babe Ruth. When he met President Coolidge, he said to him, "Hot as hell, ain't it, Prez?" Called him Prez, P-R-E-Z. At a party, Ruth referred to the hosts as the host and hoster. Yeah, he made $80,000 in 1930. Somebody said to him, "Don't you feel badly? You made more money than President Hoover did." That was the first full year of the Great Depression. Ruth said, "No, I don't feel badly. I had a better year than he did." Okay. He was also a total lack of modesty. He would invite women up to his hotel room when they were on the road, and they'd be prancing around naked. His friends walking in and out. He didn't pay any attention to anything. And Ruth could never remember a name. He called everybody kid. There was a guy named Wade Hoyt who played for the Yankees for 11 years. And he was traded to the Detroit Tigers. And so in the dugout, when Ruth found out, he walks up to him, he says, "Well, good luck to you, Walter." His name was Wade. He played beside him for 11 years. Didn't know his first name. "Good luck to you, Walter." Somebody wrote that Babe Ruth, this was probably H.L. Mencken, the wit from Baltimore, that said this: Babe Ruth liked the pitches over the plate to be high balls. He liked to hit high balls. He liked to drink high balls, too. In later years, after he left baseball, and he'd been married a couple of times, and he became a very lonely and somewhat of a pathetic individual, but his heart was always in the right place. And I recently came across a Time magazine from late 1941, and there was a little, people in the news kind of thing. It said Babe Ruth in Midtown Manhattan had gone into a bank. This was right after Pearl Harbor. In fact, later the same month of Pearl Harbor, Babe Ruth walked into a bank and said, "I want to buy $100,000 worth of war bonds right now." And the banker said, "Well, there's a $50,000 limit per year." And Ruth says, "Fine, I'll write 2 checks." He did. He dated one of them like December 28th, the next one January 3rd, 1942, and walked out. So there's a patriot. Ruth and Gehrig on Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day, July 4th, 1939, when the Yankee fans poured into Yankee Stadium to pay tribute to the dying Lou Gehrig. And Ruth comes up, throws his arms around him, and they kind of kissed and made up. That's Babe Ruth. On April 27th, 1947, his last appearance at Yankee Stadium, He was dying of throat cancer, and he died in the summer of 1948. In fact, August 16th, 1948. Not a good day to die. Elvis Presley also died on August 16th. But Babe Ruth was the first one, famous one, to die on that day. And yes, as you can see here, his body in a casket. It's in Yankee Stadium. Babe Ruth's body lay in Yankee Stadium for 3 days. And I actually remember this, okay? I'm dating myself. I was 7 years old in 1948. We didn't have a television set yet in our house, but down the street somebody did. And there was an old lady who, probably much younger than I am now, she seemed old, and she was babysitting for my friend Steve, and there was this long lines of people, and they were looking at a body, and what's that, Mrs. Mims? She says, that's Babe Ruth, famous baseball player. I think that's probably the first time I ever heard of him. Anyway, Babe Ruth, sad last year's most famous baseball player ever, whose name transcends the sport, perhaps the most famous athlete ever. Only one other comes to mind. Does anybody want to throw out a name?
Jim Thorpe. Jesse.
What was the other one? Jim Thorpe and who? Okay.
Jesse the track star.
The name that's come up is Muhammad Ali, whom I was told a few years ago was the most famous athlete in the world to this day. Now, I don't know who compiled this survey, but it's possible. But certainly Babe Ruth transcended the sport of baseball. Okay, we're going to move along to another figure in the 1920s, and his name was Charles Augustus Lindbergh. By the way, what time did we start, Tom? Did you notice?
Close to 8.
We've been going about 20 minutes? Okay,
Yes.
we're fine. Charles Augustus Lindbergh was born February 4th, 1902 in Detroit, Michigan. His father was an immigrant from Sweden. His name was also Charles Lindbergh. And he was a conservative Republican who served in Congress in the House of Representatives from 1907 to 1917. Some of that time, his son was with him. The parents were divorced at some time during that period. And he attended a private school, Charles Lindbergh did, with the sons of the man who happened to live in the White House at that time by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, Charles Lindbergh played on the White House lawn with two of the Roosevelt boys. How different can you be in childhood than Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh? Actually, Lindbergh in school didn't get along too well. He was never much of a student. I don't know why he moved around so much. That never became clear, but he attended 11 different schools before he went to college. He was a mediocre student. In his first year at the University of Wisconsin, where he wanted to study engineering, he flunked out. So he then decided that he wanted to become an aviator. Over the next couple of years, he made over 700 flights, barnstorming. His plane crashed 4 times. He claimed he had bailed out of more, he had to bail out 4 different times. He claimed he had bailed out of more planes than any man still alive. Probably true. He then became an airmail pilot after these barnstorming flights. And remember, aviation was new. We're talking about the period around the First World War. People would go out to the fields and watch these guys take off and go do flip their plane upside down in the air and do all kinds of things. It was pretty dangerous stuff. But becoming an airmail pilot had a lot of status attached to it. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, who was then president a couple of times, was present to shake hands with new airmail pilots and who were standing in a line to meet him, that kind of thing. So then, by the early 1920s, he became very ambitious, middle to mid-1920s, about his flying. And there was something called the Orteig Prize. And this man, Orteig, said that he would pay $25,000 to anybody that would fly the Atlantic from New York to the continent. that he would pay $25,000 to whoever could do this. By the way, I checked it out, that's $345,000 in today's dollars. I was surprised it wasn't more, but that's how it looked. Anyway, so he designed a plane. It was built by Ryan Aircraft. It was called the Spirit of St. Louis. Ryan Aircraft was located in San Diego, California. And how many of you, just hands, have seen the Spirit of St. Louis in the Smithsonian, in the aeronautical? Yeah, quite a number of you. Excuse me. It was a fabric covered, single seat, single engine, high wing, monoplane, one engine, 450 gallons of gas, okay? Now, on May 27th, 1925, at 25 years of age, he took off from Roosevelt Field in Long Island. It was rain, and he took off. Some people watching were afraid the plane wouldn't even get off the ground, and it was going off a cliff, and it would go right into the Atlantic Ocean. But it got off, and he flew for 33 and a half hours, 3,600 miles, no radio. Now, excuse me, he's by himself. He has no radio. He has a flashlight. He would stick the flashlight into his mouth with the light going under him to study the maps while he was going. Other people wanted this Ortiz Prize. He wasn't alone. One of them was getting ready. It was a crew of 4. Most crews had 2 people. All these other planes, as far as I could determine, had radios in them. So we have a young 25-year-old man, very quiet, soft-spoken guy, by himself in a plane without a radio, looking out of a flashlight at maps as he's crossing the Atlantic. Oh, and this tickles me. So he and his mother were close, and she had moved to Milwaukee. As I indicated, his parents had been divorced for several years by then. And she was worried about him, of course, making this flight. And he says, "I promise, Mom," he says, "when I get to Paris, I'll call you." That becomes a little funny, as you'll see in a few moments, like she wouldn't know otherwise. He says, "I'll call you when I get there so you'll know that I'm safe." Well, he flew and he flew and he flew, and suddenly off the coast of Ireland, a fisherman saw the plane, got right back to shore, and pretty soon throughout the world of, radio, Charles Lindbergh has made it. He's just been spotted off Ireland. He's on his way to France, and he's close. Now, you see there in that slide, you see the plane down and with the mobs around it. Charles Lindbergh flies over Paris. He sees the Eiffel Tower. He flies over the Eiffel Tower, and he starts heading out towards Le Bourget Field, I hope I pronounced that correctly, where he was supposed to land. And all he sees are lights, just huge lights everywhere. And he's thinking to himself, that's strange, I didn't know there was all this industry out here. He thought it was factories at work or something. It was hundreds, probably thousands of cars trying to get to the airport to meet him. That's what those lights were. And so he lands, and Lindbergh's Paris trip makes him a world hero. Just like that, he became the most famous man in the world. I never did learn whether he called his mother, but she sure knew about it, that's for sure. So he also gets to meet President Coolidge, as Babe Ruth had, but I doubt if he said "ate it hot, Pres" or something like that. We don't know what Charles Lindbergh said to Coolidge or vice versa. Coolidge was a reticent man, to be sure, man of very few words, and Lindbergh actually was too. So he has a ticker tape parade in New York City. By the way, the ticker tape parade started back in the 1880s. The first ticker tape parade in New York was honoring the people that built the Statue of Liberty and brought it over from France. And then Theodore Roosevelt got a ticker tape parade after he was president and after a return from Africa, where he was hunting big game. in 1912, and General Pershing, the World War I hero, people like that. Well, Charles Lindbergh got one in May of 1927, and it was really something. And then he finds true love. Her name was Anne Morrow, M-O-R-R-O-W. Her father was the President Coolidge's ambassador to Mexico, and they were married in 1927. They had 6 children. We all have heard, those of us who are older still maybe incorrectly think of it as Time Magazine's Man of the Year. It's now the Person of the Year, as it should have always been, but they didn't honor women back then. Charles Lindbergh was Time Magazine's first Man of the Year. The magazine actually started in 1923, but it was 1927 before they had Man of the Year, and it was Charles Augustus Lindbergh that year. Now, things started to go wrong after that. He married Anne Morrow. They bought an estate in New Jersey. Lindbergh started having problems with the press because he had no privacy. He was out on a cruise when he was married. The wedding ceremony actually took place. Planes were flying over, taking his picture and everything. In any event, the crime of the century up to that time was the kidnapping of his oldest son, Charles Lindbergh Jr. Somebody here remembers that? Wow. Wow. How old were you then?
I mean, I remember reading about it.
Okay.
You were there.
Well, he says he was there. Charles Lindbergh Jr. lived from 1930 to 32. He was asleep in an upstairs bedroom at the Lindbergh estate. Somebody climbed a ladder, kidnapped him, and his body was discovered about 5 weeks later. He had been brutally killed. A man named Richard Hauptmann, H-A-U-P-T-M-A-N-N, a German national, was arrested, charged, and electrocuted for the crime. To the moment the lights went out for Mr. Hauptmann, he denied that he had done it. And that's not a judgment on my part.
What year was it?
1936 is when he was electrocuted.
Well, I was born in 28.
Okay, so you would remember hearing all about this. You were 8 years old in 1936. Okay, very good. So the Little Lindbergh, that resulted in the Little Lindbergh laws. And of course, an awful lot of sympathy for the Lindbergh family, for him and his wife, Anne. Now remember, at that point, he was still a great American hero who was just minding his own business, or trying to get on in the world. And after that, he packed up and left. He lived in England for a while. He lived in Germany for a while. And then he came back. And as we finalize the comments here on Lindbergh, I think of him as in 3 or 4 stages. First of all, there's Charles Lindbergh, the American hero. That he certainly was. And his skill as an aviator, I doubt, has ever had appeared. Enormous undertaking that he did, and with a lot of raw courage. So he became an American hero, and then the name Charles Lindbergh became an American tragedy because of his little boy, who was kidnapped for no other reason than his name was Charles Lindbergh. And then in the late 30s, Lindbergh's public persona took on a new look. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but it needs to be covered. And not a lot of detail, because what I really want to talk about was the hero Lindbergh was as a pilot, and what he achieved by flying the Atlantic against overwhelming odds. But in the late 1930s, he became somewhat enamored of the Germans, and the Third Reich in particular. And he was decorated by Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, in 1938, I believe it was. And he came home, and then he was the first one to use America first. In fact, until our current president and his using the term America first, I always just associated that with Charles A. Lindbergh. And his points were just 2 or 3 very succinct points. Number one, England can't survive German bombing when they get to that point, and why do we care? Number two, the Jews are responsible if we go to war. In fact, in a gathering, full house at Madison Square Garden in 1940. Charles Lindbergh said that Roosevelt, that the Jews around him were leading us into a war, that this was a war that needn't be fought, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to bring up the name at this point, just very briefly, of another famous character. When I say character, odd guy, fascinating. His name was Henry Ford. Built cars and automobiles. And Henry Ford and Lindbergh, Henry Ford also was very anti-Semitic. He bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, in 1918, which was really an anti-Semitic rag. Anyway, Lindbergh would go out to Henry Ford's farm in Michigan, and they would spend hours, and somebody later asked Henry Ford, what did you talk about, you and Lindbergh, all the time? And Ford's answer was, Jews, Jews, and Jews. That was his answer. So, there was that's the third chapter. First he was an American hero, then an American tragedy, then became a real American controversy, and then he finally died. When I say finally, he wasn't that old. He died in 1974 in Hawaii. He lived on Maui. He's buried over there. He was 72 years old. He died of cancer. And now there's the fourth phase, and we'll call it American family or modern family. What we have learned now is that, well, do you remember that old TV show, anybody here, from the 50s called I Led 3 Lives? It was about a guy that was FBI who posed as a communist and so on and so on. Well, Charles Lindbergh led several lives. He had extramarital affairs with one German woman in Germany. He had 2 sons and a daughter. With her sister, he had 2 more children. And with a German secretary, he still had 2 more children. It has now been validated that Charles Augustus Lindbergh had 13 children, 6 of them by his wife, one of whom deceased at age 2, and another 7 by 3 other women, all in Germany, where he would appear from time to time and live as a family man with these other families. So again, American hero, American tragedy, American controversy. Now, that's not exactly an American family. I don't know what you'd call it, but at first I read it, I didn't believe it. I thought,
Hollywood.
Yeah, Hollywood. Where does this come from? But actually it's been validated. Charles Lindbergh left 13 kids by 4 different women. That concludes my comments for this evening about Babe Ruth, Charles Lindbergh, the 1920s, and I'll certainly entertain any questions if you have any.